Hi, I'm Dallas Taylor of 20,000 Hertz, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
This is MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Hello, I'm Kevin May.
And I'm Wendy Morrill. Welcome back to MetaPod.
Yes, in fact, welcome to the 20th episode of MetaPod. And for our 20th episode, we are featuring 20,000 Hertz, a podcast that explores the stories around the world's most recognizable and interesting sounds.
That's right. We had a fascinating conversation with Dallas Taylor, host of 20,000 Hertz, about all things sound related. If you're curious about sonic branding, how sound is designed to support film, or how to become more conscious of your sound environment, Dallas is your man and 20,000 Hertz is your podcast.
Seriously. Okay, right, let's start the tape then, and we'll be back after the interview with a quick quiz.
And a few of the most unrecognizable sounds. Okay, start the tape.
Dallas Taylor from 20,000 Hertz. Thank you so much for joining us on MetaPod this week. Really appreciate your company.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, let's just dive straight in if we can. And if I may, let me get the silly question out of the way first, and you'll have to forgive me and listeners who perhaps haven't heard the reason why from listening to your podcast, but why 20,000 Hertz? Why not 1,000 Hertz or 50,000 Hertz?
Yeah, so if you think of a speaker cone, sound works as pressure and then like a vacuum. So when you push the speaker cone out and then you pull it back and then you go back to that middle point, that's one cycle. So that's pushing the air, sucking the air back, and then kind of starting back over. But when we see speakers, if you see them doing like really low pitched stuff, you can really see that woofer going whoa, 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 whoa. So that's essentially a hertz, and we can hear as humans, or at least when we're children, we can generally hear all the way up to 20,000 hertz. So 1 hertz is basically 1 second of a cycle, so low that we can't hear it. Usually when we get around 20 hertz, we start to feel it and start to perceive it. So 20 of those cycles per second. And then as that speaker gets faster, the pitch goes up. And so we can hear as humans up to, depending on your age, but somewhere between 14,000 to 20,000 hertz. And of course, dogs can hear above that. But this is a show about humans, so I did 20,000 hertz.
Okay. Try not to get too geeky, because we may have lots of lay people listening, but one of which is me. So you'll have to bear with us if we ask you to clarify certain things. My next question really, Dallas, is, you're involved in sound not only as a podcast host, but your job is as a sound engineer, and your career is this, very storied journey through different kind of sound type jobs. Tell us, when did you realize sound was going to be something that would be an important part of your career and indeed your life?
Well, at the end of elementary school, around 5th grade, I wasn't particularly interested in most subjects like math and science and history, which is interesting because now I'm all into all of those things. But at the time, I grew up in a really, really poor area of Arkansas, in a poor school. And I don't know, I didn't have a lot of direction. But in 5th grade, that's when you got to pick, if you were going to join the band, you got to pick your instrument. And somebody put a trumpet in my hands, and I somehow miraculously was good at this trumpet after not really being interested in a lot of these other subjects. And so that was the moment where I felt like I was kind of latching onto something. And all of the band directors and private lessons teachers were going like well above and beyond to help me get out of this like poor area of Arkansas. And that was really the moment where I realized, or not really moment, but that's really when I realized during that phase of my life that something in music and sound was going to be critical to like my long-term work.
Okay.
Could you tell us, Dallas, what exactly is sound design? What types of things do you do in sound design?
So outside of the podcast, I own a sound design company called De Facto Sound, and I started that after working for television networks. So I've worked for NBC, Fox, G4, Discovery, the Discovery Channel, and all of their networks as an in-house sound designer. A little over a decade ago, I started my own company because I wanted to work with National Geographic and HBO, and at the time there wasn't Netflix, but eventually Netflix and game trailers and documentaries and all kinds of stuff. So sound design itself is really everything outside, or at least the way that I perceive it, and there is debate within the sound design community of where those barriers are. I consider, at least in my line of work, which are trailers, advertising, promos, documentaries, that sound design is all encompassing. But when you get into movies, kind of what sound design is very specific to like creature effects or like very high concept types of sounds. Mm-hmm. With my side of it, I kind of think of sound design and mixing as like a holistic approach. And so it's essentially everything minus the music. And so when we get like a trailer or an advertising spot, they usually sound terrible. Like the dialogue sounds really funky because it hasn't really been treated. It's recorded well, but hasn't really been treated. The environments don't sound great when they're picked up on set because that's not really the intent. The intent on set is just to get great dialogue. Mm-hmm. So most of the time we're rebuilding all the ambiences, all the footsteps, all the things you touch, all of the birds or all of the wind, all of that's recreated. Mm-hmm. So really everything outside of just composing something like a music track is what I do as my day job.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with other human senses when designing sound?
Yeah, a lot of what goes into the influence of the sound is, at least in my world, the only other sense that we have to work with, unless we're working, at Disney World or something where they do have like smellitzers and things like that and kind of senses of touch. But in my line of work, it's usually just visuals and sound. And so the things that really influence how we sound design is how the editor paces something, like how slow or fast it's moving. If there's music, that music can also influence how we, the choices that we make. Like, do we want it to kind of the sound design to be like melded with the music, or do we want it to be distinct from the music? It's one of those things that like even with wind or environments or really any sounds, we can make them dissonant or very positive sounding. So even just environments, we can lean into something being a little eerie or lean into something being tense or lean into something being really pleasant. So the other things, especially in kind of advertising and things, is we're even looking at color, like how they choose to color the picture can tell us a lot about how we want to support that. How cinematographers frame things. There's a lot of storytelling strategy in the way that things are framed, which clue us in to supporting that. So yeah, we're always trying to lean into how is the viewer meant to feel in this.
And is sound design, are there international characteristics to it? Are there cultural considerations when you might be working for a client in another country, or is it fairly universal?
Absolutely. But I would say that the American style of sound design is usually what we get very, focused into. So a lot of times we're getting even international clients that want that really American style. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm talking about like the difference between American and, we'll say like the UK style. With the UK, we notice that at least traditionally on set, they seem to be a little bit more in tune, or they like for the actual set itself to feel a little bit more natural, like the dialogue to be embedded within that set. So if you see kind of I'm thinking of like a period piece that might be in like a castle, you might hear the room more because they're choosing to kind of pull the boom back a little bit. They're choosing to hear those reflections more. Where the American style of sound design and mixing is very dry, like extraordinarily dry. So I would say like the peak American style is going to be something like a Marvel movie, something that where the dialogue is probably re-recorded in a studio from top to bottom. It's incredibly clean, incredibly dry. Every footstep is mic'd from 2 inches away from someone doing footstep sounds. But that style just gets a very, very punchy, like crystal clear style. And that's not necessarily good or bad. Whereas other countries might like to feel the environment more from the set. And so that's something that I've noticed quite a bit. And we generally on the advertising side lean into this very like movie-esque punchiness. It's at least for car commercials and stuff. We're always trying to go not real, but hyper real. And that seems to be kind of our sweet spot.
Working for film or sonic branding, are those two different skill sets in terms of creativity, or are they fairly similar?
They're pretty far apart. So when you're doing sonic branding, that's almost like doing a visual mark, like a visual logo, where there's going to be a long period of just getting to the bottom of what a company believes, what they want to project, what they want their customers to feel about their brand. That is something that is so embedded within a marketing plan that there's a long exploratory process that then gets us to a place where we can start letting that influence, just like a visual mark. Whereas with filmmaking, it's such a long, sonic branding is like 3 seconds. Trying to like give someone a feeling, whereas filmmaking is very much critical on where the story is coming from, going, what's happening currently, how the tension between characters or lack of tension. So it's very much like a storytelling feel where sound designers are leaning into these moments where maybe sound design might be taking the lead emotionally over music, or sometimes music would be taking the lead over sound design. And so, yeah, they're completely different approaches. And usually it's very rare that the same type of companies do both of those.
Okay.
One word you mentioned a couple of times just a couple of moments ago, Dallas, was the word dry. How do you describe a dry sound for us?
Yeah, so my microphone here, I chose this particular microphone because it's just so clean. It doesn't pick up anything. Like if my kids are screaming down the hallway, it's really only going to pick up what's right in front of it. And so it's an extraordinarily clean, dry sound.
Right.
Whereas if I had a different type of mic, like I use a dynamic microphone, SM7 for anybody who's interested. But if I was using something like a condenser mic, even at the same distance from that, they're so sensitive that you might hear the creaks in my room, you might hear my notifications going off, you might hear my cell phone buzz. Right. But it just doesn't pick up anything. This mic that I use just doesn't pick up anything. So I can do a pickup in a hotel or in my office. It's all going to sound the same. That technique would go into all aspects of recording, so especially Foley. Whereas if we were going to try to get something that's more of a wet sound, we might want to pull the microphone away from the source more to where we can hear those reflections off of the wall. But generally, at least here in the U.S. style of mixing, mixers, sometimes it gets divvied up between a sound designer or sound design team and then mixers. Generally, what a mixer is going to want is something incredibly dry and crisp. So when you hear that footstep, it is nothing, because they want to add their environment artificially to where they have all of those choices. So it's kind of the difference of like reverb being baked in versus reverb being a choice later. Whereas in other countries, they may want to hear, and it gives a different sense. Like they may want to hear that big cathedral type of room that the actors are in. Whereas in America, they might wrap everything around the camera with sound blankets to just kill off any reflections to where they can bring that back later artificially.
Yeah, fascinating. Is the science of sound actually quite easy to understand? first of all? And if it is, can you give us give us some basic science for those that are tuning in that perhaps don't quite understand it, like a science for dummies almost?
Yeah. So I'm not an acoustician, and so I have my own kind of very dumbed down version that I think acousticians would cringe at. But as the way that I kind of understand the physics of sound, what's fascinating is that light can travel from one point in the universe all the way to the other side of the universe, and that's amazing, via the speed of light.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas sound really is so negligible in the universe that it almost doesn't exist in the form that we hear it. The universe is a vacuum, almost. If you said 99.9, almost infinite. The universe is a vacuum. There's no sound because there's no air for that sound to travel through. If you were kind of suddenly exposed to the vacuum of space, it would just suck all the air out of you explosively. It would be very ugly, but there would be no mechanism for sound to do anything because there's just no way that it can travel. So luckily, we have this incredibly thin blanket of air that we generally can't feel. Sometimes we notice it when we go, really high up in altitude. It might be a little harder to breathe. Whereas being at sea level, where it seems very easy and we have plenty of air, but we need air in order to have sound. And to go back to the speaker idea, so it's vibrating. Essentially, it's pushing out, it's pulling back, and then it's going and doing that over and over again. That's essentially how sound moves through the air. A lot of people can talk about it like if you throw a rock into a pond. I think of that as like a two-dimensional version of what sound does. Okay. So you throw the rock into the pond, and then two-dimensionally it ripples out. Sound is three-dimensional. So when that speaker cone pushes out, or when you talk, or when any sound is made, it goes in every direction that's not blocked. There might be a primary direction, who you're facing, but it basically just ripples out invisibly into every direction, or the direct direction. By pushing out, pushing in, and then over time, because of the friction and the atmospheric pressure, enough of that pressure will basically start to slow that down. It's like throwing a rock into the ocean. Eventually, there is no wave because it just propagates and it kind of vaporizes. The same thing happens with sound. So that's probably my simplest way. Hopefully, that was easy to follow.
No, that was terrific. So, what are some of the kind of the current advances in sound science and design that excite you and should hopefully excite our listeners? Where is it all kind of going, do you think?
It's hard to say, but I think, and I'm probably really biased considering I host a show about sound, but in my world, it seems like there's more people, and this is intentional for my part, more laymen, just humans that are just getting more interested in how sound affects the brain and making environments sound better once you kind of consciously tune into it. I think that at least over time, at least over the next few decades, I hope that we start to really understand how sound can have a hugely negative influence in our life and how it can have a hugely positive influence. So if you can, think about it from kind of like a humanities scale, it's like humans have been hearing and making sound for like 1 million years. But we're in the first, second, third generation of very, very like abrasive human-made sounds. So like our brains are 100,000 years in the past, yet we're being so bombarded by things sonically, notifications, which is something that just interrupts you in a moment. A creak of a house that makes you think that immediately your fight or flight mechanism kicks in, and you immediately think that it must be danger. That's a normal reaction to things that we just can't control. I think we're going to reach a bit of a volume breaking point at some point, especially now that we have like electric vehicles and traffic that should start to get quieter. I think we're going to start craving that, not necessarily quietness, but quietness from human-made noise, because our brains are in tune with nature. I think most people can identify with the fact that how healthy going on a walk is, or especially if you're in the woods or if you're on a trail or if you're on a mountain. When you're in nature, or if you're in a beach, or or on water, like when you're in nature, something feels right about that. And a part of it has to do with the sense of touch, the sense of sight, and seeing green and is something that's healthy for us. But the same thing goes for sound. It's healthy to hear birds. It's healthy to hear insects. It's healthy to hear the crackle of a fire. It's healthy to hear the sound of a babbling brook, because we've heard that for hundreds of thousands of years. And our brains, for me, I mean, this is just the sound of trickling water that you could probably drink is probably just an amazing sound. But that's very biological too. And what I hope is that we kind of start to pull ourselves into an understanding of how much of a barrage we're getting right now sonically, and how that's probably not a healthy thing.
I do wonder if this last 12 months and what we've all been going through as a society may allow us to kind of reflect on that. And the reason I say this, I live 5 miles from one of the UK's busiest airports, London Stansted, and ordinarily there's something taking off or landing every 60 to 90 seconds. And it was, April last year when walking the dog, and we suddenly realized just how quiet everything was again. And it was like an appreciation of our environment. Oh, this is what it's like when there isn't a plane flying over every 90 seconds. So it's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, I think that at least sound is something that generally we have a hard time making conscious, but it's very easy to. It's basically if you tell yourself to make your sound world conscious, your brain will just flip over into it. And we did a show all about John Cage's 433, which a lot of people call like the silent piece, but it's really not about silence. It's about celebrating sound. When you flick that switch in your mind to really be hyper aware of sound. And where would you be more hyper aware of sound than a piano player sitting in a concert not doing anything? You're going to hear every cough, you're going to hear every shuffle, you're going to hear every little noise there. But the point of that was for you to become conscious about sound. So if you ever want to become conscious, just say, I want to become conscious about sound right now. And you can start to hear things that your brain filters out all the time. Our brains are very good at filtering out, especially things we hear a lot.
Yeah.
I wish I could filter out my neighbors upstairs.
Oh, that's hard.
On the topic, I'm calling it acoustic design for health, safety, and optimal sensory experience. I think you talk about this in the episode titled Sonic Utopia. And I think it's also related a bit to your episode on the deterrent tone of the LRADs. I was telling Kevin that, we'd listened to all these episodes and I felt that there were negative aspects of sound missing. And then I listened to these 2 episodes today and there they were. Are there some things that you're concerned about in the next 10 years in terms of advances in people's sonic environments? I mean, are there a couple of good things and a couple of scary things?
Yeah, generally, I don't like covering shows that kind of bang the drum of noise pollution a lot. We did that a good bit, like enough in our show that I don't feel like we really need to anymore. So I kind of vowed, like, I'm gonna take a break off of that. And then throughout 2020 and even recently, we found out that these devices called LRADs, which were originally designed to be attached to naval warships, because it's actually used for long range. It's a long range acoustic device. It's designed to be able to communicate with people without, radios or whatnot over long distances. That is great. Like the idea, it's just a super loud megaphone. So if someone's trapped somewhere on a mountain, you can point it at the mountain and say, hey, we're on our way, whatever. There's a lot of great uses for that. But there's also this thing called the deterrent tone. And it was designed as a military weapon for ships.
Yeah.
These tools are designed to be used from hundreds of yards away. So that ended up being like, this is a non-lethal way of being able to, really deter protesters, and because it's even considered a it's not force. There's no force involved because it's sound, which is incorrect. And I think that with the LRAD, and to long story short, this is like the volume of us being on the space shuttle, like launch pad when it goes off. Like these volume levels can very quickly cause permanent hearing damage and completely take away hearing entirely. I've heard stories of people who fluid comes out of their ear, presumably the balance fluid, because it just bursts it. But I think that is where a cultural lack of understanding of sound becomes incredibly important to start telling these stories. I don't like telling negative stories, but when I see that sound is now being used as a weapon due to a lack of knowledge of acoustics and hearing, and again, because we think about our other four senses all the times as human, but sound gets kind of trickled down to this bottom rung, then it's unacceptable. And so that's what I'm most fearful of and I hope that doing this episode was the start of some sort of actionable change, because it should not be used in this regard. I think that I would consider this the same as if you're trying to control protesters by a machete chopping off their hands or feet. Like you can't just take things away from people like permanently. That seems very unethical. Mm-hmm. We all know not to look at someone welding, because that can hurt your eyes. You wouldn't, have a bunch of welders like pushing people back, trying to destroy their eyesight. And so, so for me, it's very obvious that that's something that should be regulated out. I'm not necessarily citing, against law enforcement or for protesters or anything. I'm just saying that this device itself should not be the method. Just like a machine gun mowing people down should not be the method of of deterring people. So there is a limit to these things, and with the platform and with the podcast, I felt that it would be gross negligence on my part not to tell that story.
Are there other ways that you are thinking about a call to action on that front? I mean, to get people to understand sound better in order to consider who controls it, who regulates it, how they can get involved in that?
I've been thinking about that. I'm not even exactly sure where to start. With everything being so hyper politicized here, it's like you're either on one side or the other. It's tough. I mean, due to a lot of bad things that's happened, we're kind of stuck in this limbo of figuring out some very basic problems before it seems like we can get to more nuanced problems. And I hate that this is even a more nuanced problem. I wouldn't say it is. But yeah, there's just a lot of nasty stuff. But I just wanted to hyper focus on this device, and hopefully someone will hear this, or hopefully someone would pass it along to a congressperson.
Well, maybe we can move on to a more fun topic.
I'm down with that.
I know Kevin wants to know about the earworm.
Ah, yes. Is there any... what is the science or something behind the earworm? I hope it's a phrase that you know.
Science behind it. I do not know any science behind it. Did we do a show on earworms? I know we've talked about it in the past. There's a great show on YouTube called Earworm. That's one of the best. It's a huge inspiration for 20,000 Hertz.
Okay.
Science of earworms, though, I don't think I have a great answer for that. I don't think we've done the like quintessential earworm show yet, so I'm kind of like in the dark myself of if there's science. I think the people that would really know this, and it would be a fascinating conversation to chat with. I don't think they're really ghostwriters, but I think you'd be surprised to find out how many songs from very famous artists are not written by the artists. They're written by professional songwriters. And there's definitely like structures and things that they follow. I'm just convincing myself right now that I need to do that show. I'd love to talk to like professional songwriters who've written some of the biggest things that everyone has heard of, to get to like the root of how that was built out.
I hope we've inspired you for a future episode of 20,000 Hertz. One of my favorite episodes that I've listened to so far was the one about the sounds of the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was terrific. But I wonder, how is the science kind of developing in terms of 30 years ago, the first sounds were applied to those dinosaurs on the on those films, and over time they may have changed as more understanding from paleontology and science has developed. I mean, is that something that's quite common on? I'm not saying that they're guessing what a sound is going to be, because there is a lot of, as you say, science from paleontology has gone into that. But is it evolving over time?
Yeah, for sure. I think just like on the visual side, we're starting to realize that dinosaurs may have been covered with feathers and other things.
Sorry, I don't know why I'm laughing about that. It seems absurd that dinosaurs are covered in feathers. Please carry on.
I think that we need to kind of go back to like logic and think about what benefit would it be for these big things to not be covered in anything and just be skin. How often do we see that around here? We do see that in crocodiles and alligators and reptiles and things, sure. But I know that, at least from my very limited paleontology understanding, that dinosaurs are more closely related to birds. And so if we look into that, we go, do we have any birds with no feathers? Do we have birds that have any benefit of not being covered in any way? So there's been, people have found fossils of feathers from tails of dinosaurs and things. And so we think about that. And then over on the sonic side, we think, what benefit would it be for any animal across the board, which we don't see anywhere in our current nature, to roar at its meal before it eats it? Like, that would be as if and in the episode we say this, that would be as if we have a cheeseburger, but we yell at it and then we eat it. So yeah, you have to know that there's like a difference between the emotional effect of scary dinosaurs and how that's going to be treated in Hollywood versus reality. And I think that it just, with Jurassic Park 1, I think it was just kind of like a convenient time to take a lot of liberties with that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but over the next, 50 years or so, we might look at Jurassic Park as being one of the most inaccurate films of all time as our science gets has more understanding. But, I've talked to the sound designers of Jurassic Park. They understand this. This is not like a big conspiracy or anything. It's just movie making. And with our understanding at the moment, it's fun to think about how dinosaurs would be really scary and roar at us and sound awesome.
I must say I'm quite disappointed to learn that perhaps you don't roar before you bite into a cheeseburger. Well, how do you decide on a topic? You're 100+ episodes now. You've covered this amazing array of different issues and ideas. I mean, how do you decide?
For a long time, I wanted to program, and we still do this to a certain degree, but I wanted to program surprises. Like, I always used to link an emotion alongside a show. So if we were doing a show, like right at the beginning, like our very first episode was the voice of Siri. What I wanted that to feel like was just joy. I wanted to kick off the show with joy. Something just really geeky and fun and cool and a factoid. But then we went to NBC, and I knew that was going to be a history story. So I wanted nostalgia to be the key motivator in that. Anyway, the third episode, whatever it was, maybe it was Dolls That Talk or something. I wanted to be creepy, and I wanted to feel that way. Because I like when podcasts kind of are always a little surprising with things. So I was always attaching like a feeling that I was hoping that the listeners would get that would be different from the next show and the following and so forth. And we carried that theme on for a while. Now, as far as the actual topics, usually it's always kind of been rooted in here's a concept or here's a sound that I'm just interested in. We generally, a lot of other highly produced podcasts, and we fall into this trap where we can't really pitch other podcasts because they kind of want to know what's the entire story arc in on paper before we even greenlight it. Whereas we're like, God, I bet there's got to be a story behind the Netflix to dumb sound. Let's find out. Let's greenlight it. Let's just move. So we do a lot of like, that sounds cool. There's got to be a cool story. Like the I'm Lovin' It thing from McDonald's. We didn't know anything about it. We just thought, there's got to be an awesome story behind that. And it seems very Sonic-y. Like when COVID hit, I immediately put a little pre-roll out saying that I'm not an expert in this. And there's so much, especially back then in March, there's so much misinformation. We didn't know where things were going. We didn't know the science. Everyone was trying to figure it out. And I essentially just said that like, we're just not going to be that source of misinformation. None of us are experts on this, but we are experts on sound. And so I promised the audience that we would be an escape. And so since that point, except for just a couple changes, the goal has been very consistently joy.
Yeah, all I'm thinking of here is the character Joy in the Pixar film Inside Out, rather than sadness. But just related to that question, I guess, is do you get brands pitching to you to feature their brand, kind of sonic brand, just because, you know, a couple of the really good episodes, the THX doubleheader was great. The Netflix one and the McDonald's ones are really good. But do you get companies now, because of the popularity of the podcast, saying, hey, you know what, we've got a brilliant sound. We would love you to dissect it for your audience because we know it's a bit of branding for us?
We get a lot of pitches from like music companies or like PR groups and stuff trying to get press for these companies. Anything that smells of PR or something like that doesn't work. Now, interestingly, some of these music companies that we've declined based off of their pitches because they felt too marketing focused and like we just need to be in front of this audience. Some of those we've come back around when we found out that they were behind some of the sounds that we wanted to cover, and so that's happened a couple of times. But generally, no, we don't do that. But it's funny, I say generally no, but we actually do have a sponsored episode coming up for the first time in our history.
Okay.
We did an episode about the founder of Bose, Amar Bose. And that was that came out of advertising. So Bose basically, there's two major events that happened in 20,000 Hertz. First, Roman Mars playing one of our shows early on 99PI seeded a huge portion of our audience. That led to exposure that just kind of continued that ball rolling. The second thing that really happened is we got some advertising along the way, but like I was spending way more on the show than what we were receiving. From the very beginning, I did not want anyone to have to not be paid for my passion project. So every single person on any front of 20,000 Hertz minus me has been paid for what they do. And the second thing that was one of the biggest moments that I didn't mention in the show, but Bose came along and sponsored 13 episodes of the podcast outright. Now, to the listeners, some listeners, the very cynical ones, would say you're a shill for Bose and like you're just, whatever. But on the back end, they saved the show. But along the way, when I went to Framingham, Massachusetts, I went to the Bose headquarters. I interviewed some of the engineers and some of the brand people. I really clicked with them. Like it wasn't even from a like marketing standpoint. And then along the way, I heard the story of the heart of the founder, Amar Bose, and I was so blown away. Most of Bose's profits goes to MIT for research, and I loved that. And they call it the gift, and MIT and Bose are very intertwined. And I just loved it so much that I felt a responsibility to tell the story. So that did come on the heels of like a 13 episode marketing campaign, but it was like my secret way of thanking Bose for saving this show. So that was not a sponsored episode, but we do have one coming up with Shure. But it'll only ever work if it feels perfect. I also happened to find out organically through the Shure team, who I've started to become in contact with. I just realized how nice they were and how their passions were, and just how deep of a history it was, that I just found the story fascinating. And then they decided, we would like to have help financially on that they'd love to tell us. So I'm basically telling the story of this microphone right here. And I've always wanted to do a show on microphones, but I didn't know what the angle was. And it just kind of all organically came together. I've worked with companies, Roland on their 808 show. That was not sponsored in any way, but sometimes listeners are pretty allergic to like a brand message because, there's a lot of like just slimy brands. That doesn't happen in the audio world. Every audio company I've ever had a conversation with are just incredibly passionate about the same things I'm incredibly passionate about. And the more I learn about them, the more I just realize how they're trying to make the world a better place too. I think if people kind of approach it with an open mind and not assume that it's going to be a commercial, people are going to love it just as much as any other episode we do.
Dallas, what is the most rewarding thing about doing the show?
Personally, it's all the people I get to meet, for sure, doing this. It's getting an opportunity to talk about the things that I love with other people who love this as well. when I started the show, I did not know how many people would even be into this topic. But when that platform, and especially as amplified by someone like Roman Mars, who has been a huge influence in my business, my personal life, and in the podcast, when now I'm talking to 125,000 people, the most personally rewarding thing that I get is just conversations for just fall out of the sky, and I adore it. Like, it's the most fun thing. A lot of emails and stuff will start with like, "Oh, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm really into this thing too, and I was really affected because of this, that, and the other." And I'm like, "You're not bothering me. This is exactly what I like, fuels my fire to keep doing it." So by far, it's the people and the conversations.
Are there any controversies in your community?
It's not controversy, but it is a big passion that I don't talk about on the show, but it's extraordinarily important to our team. A lot of what we have issues with is it definitely comes from like a grumpy audiophile gatekeepy direction.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I wanted to start the show is I just wanted it to be really positive, and then highlight voices that are not traditionally voices that you hear in these leadership roles or speaking as authorities. So we won't point out someone's race or gender, but we highlight those voices all the time, because I also, it's a very fine line, because I don't like to say kind of like, what is it like being a person of color in audio? Because they're already an expert,
Yeah.
and I just want to feature their thoughts. And so while that's a very important topic for our show, I just feel really passionate about putting these voices in a place. These people need to hear their voices in these roles, and in a very positive way. That's not always being directed at that issue itself. That this is the very slow ship that I'm hoping that we're going to change the tide with. It's something that I don't want to get the instant gratification of, this is wrong because of this, Like, that is very important for a lot of people, but for our show and the culture of sound, the culture of audio, it's very important for me to just highlight voices and let that play out with enough time. And I feel very fortunate that we may have the biggest audience across all platforms in sound specifically. And so I know the power, or not I know what this platform can do over the long haul.
Okay, so to take us to the finish line for this episode of MetaPod, we're going to do some rapid fire questions for you, if that's okay, Dallas. All right?
I'd love to.
Okay, right. So as quickly as you can, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one. Why is there no theme tune to 20,000 Hertz?
There used to be, and you could probably catch it in probably around episode 5 to 10 or 15. You'll hear a little thing. We had it, and then eventually I was like, this sounds... I had the realization that there was no need for a theme song when we're talking about sound design.
Okay, so we'll whiz through. What is your favorite TV show theme?
Oh, that is a cobweb that I have not dug out in a while. So let me think. DuckTales.
I'm going to have to look that one up, being from this side of
Yeah.
the pond, I think. Okay, right.
DuckTales. Ooh, any kid who grew up in the 80s is going to know that, and they're going to know just how joy-filled that is.
It's back to that joy thing again. Okay, right. I
Yeah.
suspect I might know the answer to this one. What's your favorite musical instrument?
Oof, you might think the trumpet. Singular musical instrument versus an ensemble. Those are two distinct things. The piano, because of how much you can do with it. I still have this doubt that professional pianists are even human. Like, I still can't even look at what they do and say that's possible from a human. The theory of it, especially jazz pianists and stuff, I'm just like, that's not humans can't do it. And so there's a part of my brain that goes, professional pianists are not real, because that is impossible for a human to do. Now, I will give you another answer. I think the greatest human-made sound in the world is a great symphony in a great hall. I think anyone who gets that, and this is a huge burden. I want to do a show on the symphony so badly because I want that to come back, and there's a lot of nuance to that. But that is the most it doesn't matter what the symphony's playing. If you just listen for the sense of just hearing, it's the most joy-filled vibrations that I can imagine.
Okay. What alarm sound do you wake to each morning?
Oh, I hate it. But it's that just stock Apple one that just goes radar. And also the thing I hate about it is like it's very difficult to control the volume of it. Actually, radar might be my timer sound. No, I have the one that just like ding 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 ding. It's like fades in. That's not too bad. But the one that I hate the most is that like I set a timer and I have no way to like control the volume of it. It's at like full bore every time. And I'm just too lazy to find the volume for that.
So you may have just answered this question with your last answer. What domestic or household sound do you dislike and why?
Oof. Yeah, I mean, alarm would be a thing, but I think I could probably get to it. Luckily, all of my appliances now sing little jingles, because back in my prior house, I had a dryer that just went, and that should be a positive sound. Laundry's done. I mean, I guess it's negative because you have to fold it and put it up, but I think that was like the worst because it's like, this should be positive. Now my dryer goes, it's this song. It goes, doon doo 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 doon doon doo 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 doon 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 doo 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 doon doon doo 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 doon, and I'm like, yes, laundry's done. And we're doing a show on that too. So,
wow. Okay. Is there a sound that you hear now that instantly reminds you of your childhood, not a song?
Oh, there's so many. I guess my brain's kind of on the theme songs, like if Transformers, robots in disguise. Like I probably lost my eyesight from being a foot away from the TV watching Transformers as a kid. So that brings back a very distinct memory. Frogs too. I actually grew up next to a lake and a canal, and there were bullfrogs everywhere, croaking really loudly. So that brings me back to childhood.
Favorite film soundtrack, if you have one?
Probably Inception. Oh, it's just so epic, and it's just so brilliant the way that Hans Zimmer programs it, because it's basically like the same song at different speeds that's also mimicking the levels of dream states that they're in, and it's just so good.
Okay, 2 quick ones to go. What's the loudest band you've ever seen at a show?
Metallica in Baltimore, Maryland. It was unfortunate because I really enjoy Metallica. Like I was a huge metalhead in high school, which no one knows that. I was really disappointed because because they're so proficient musicians. They're such a tight band, but at the concert, even with wearing earplugs, it was just sheer noise, like no definition at all, and I just did not like it. I actually left after like into the second song.
Do you like the sound of your own voice?
No. Who does? I mean, I guess some people do. No, I don't at all. It's very uncomfortable. I can say that I now have been able, over 5 years, been able to compartmentalize my narration voice to my, from me as a person. They are two different people. The way I present the podcast, I don't want to be I don't want to be part of the show. I don't want to be a character. So generally, it's very rare that you hear editorials from me. It's very rare that I converse back and forth, but occasionally you'll hear it. But when you hear it, it's because we were very strategic. The very next episode that we have coming up right off the bat has a conversation between me and my daughter, which is very special to me, but it's something that's very rare that you're ever going to hear on the show. But it's painful to hear my voice.
Last question, Dallas. For the MetaPod listeners who are seeking the ultimate joy, which one episode of 20,000 Hertz would you recommend they go and listen to immediately?
Oh, it's tough. Joy. I don't know. I would say like the biggest whirlwind emotionally recently has probably been the Sing Gently episode. There's joy, there's fun, there's all this stuff, and then it just gets really sad. But I would say joy, I don't know. I just like personally, the ones that I have the most fun with are just the ones that are just like taking a sound and exploring it. So Netflix or Price is Right or the Seinfeld thing or upcoming, we have the HBO thing. The next episode's about Minecraft. And so, I think we've just been leaning into those. So I would say that most of our shows are joy filled. At this point, it's very hard to pinpoint what will resonate.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for making the episode about the deterrent tone and the LRADs, because I learned a lot from that one, and I know it sounds like maybe it was an uncomfortable episode to make, but I think it was an important one. So nice job with that.
I think the negative feedback was the hardest thing to hear, or someone really missing the point, or really kind of calling it out as something polarizing. So I appreciate that.
Great. Dallas Taylor of 20,000 Hertz, thank you for talking to us here at MetaPod.
Thank you.
That was really interesting. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dallas for this conversation, which we both enjoyed very much. It's clear Dallas and his team give a lot of love and care to 20,000 Hertz.
Yes, it's a real pleasure to listen to, an escape, as he said, plus you'll learn a lot from it. If you haven't listened yet, check our recommendations for 20,000 Hertz on the MetaPod page for this episode. You'll also find social links for 20,000 Hertz there too. So Kev, let's do a few of those quiz questions that you gave to Dallas.
Okay, I say with fear and dread.
All right, tell us, or better yet, imitate the sound you wake up to each morning.
It's the hot water boiler. It's not an alarm or anything, and it goes... And you? Wendy?
Me, something like that. It gets progressively louder as you choose to ignore it longer. All right, next question. Your favorite instrument?
Simple, guitar. Yours?
Drums. We can start a band.
I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not, but anyway.
Moving to the next question. Which household sound do you despise the most? Bonus points for demonstrating it.
Well, I can refer back to my previous answer of the noise of the boiler, but I would probably say my office chair, and I suspect you would agree with me because it does have a tendency to come out on some of our recordings. And what would yours be, Wendy?
It's just our studio audience. My refrigerator, I'm going to say. It makes a really aggressive meep when the door is left open. It's unjustifiably alarming for the issue at hand, and I say it's the Karen of meeps.
Right. Do you ever get confused between the sound of your alarm and the sound of the refrigerator, given that you just demonstrated very similar noises?
No, they're very different, Kevin.
Okay. Anyway, speaking of meeps and more beeps and meeps, that brings us nicely to our next episode, which is a podcast that features a household appliance of sorts. It's an old school answering machine.
That's right, The Apology Line, a podcast about a man who ran a telephone line and answering machine where people could call in and record an apology for something they had done. Mr. Apology, he was known as, or Alan Bridge.
We speak with Marissa Bridge, or Mrs. Apology if you like, about the history of the Apology Line and her life with Mr. Apology. So subscribe or follow us on social so that you know when that episode is ready to listen to.
Okay, so I think that's it from us for now.
Indeed it is. We'll see you next time, everyone.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.